The following was recorded by John Lothe and is intended for educational purposes. This recording is not to be sold or distributed for sale. If you wish to support the work and publishing of these recordings, please visit the John Lothe Patreon page. If you come across these recordings anywhere else without my expressed support, and find that they are requesting donations for presenting this work to you, you will not be supporting the creator by doing so. This is just a friendly warning to anyone who may fall prey to predatory practices I have come across recently. Stalinism, 1924 to 1939. As Stalin gradually strengthened his internal control of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death in 1924, it became possible to turn, with increasing energy, to other matters. The new economic policy, which Lenin had adopted in 1921, performed so successfully that the Soviet Union experienced a phenomenal recovery from the depths to which war communism had dragged it in 1918 to 1921. Unfortunately for the economic theorists of the Soviet Union, the new economic policy was not really a policy at all, and it certainly was not communism. By re-establishing a new monetary system based on gold, in which one of the new gold rubles was equal to 50,000 of the old, inflated paper rubles, a firm financial basis was provided for recovery. Except for a continuance of government regulation in international trade and in large-scale heavy industry, a regime of freedom was permitted. Agricultural production rose, commercial activities flourished, and the lighter industrial activities devoted to consumers' goods began to recover. Distinctions of wealth reappeared among the peasants, the richer ones, called kulaks, being regarded with suspicion by the regime and with envy by their less fortunate neighbors. At the same time, those who made their fortunes in commerce, called nepmen, were sporadically persecuted by the regime as enemies of socialism. Nonetheless, the economic system flourished. Acreage under cultivation rose from 148 million acres in 1921 to 222 million acres in 1927. Grain collections, after the famine of 1922 had passed, approximately doubled in 1923 to 1927. Coal production doubled in 3 years, while production of cotton textiles quadrupled. As a consequence of such recovery, the Russian economic system in 1927 was, once again, back to its 1913 level, although, since population had gone up by 10 million persons, the per capita income was lower. In spite of the economic recovery of the new economic policy, it gave rise to important problems. Just as the free agricultural economy produced kulaks, and the free commercial system produced nepmen, so the mixed industrial system had undesirable consequences. Under this mixed system, industries concerned with national defense were under direct state control. Heavy industry was controlled by monopolistic trusts, which were owned by the state, but operated under separate budgets and were expected to be profitable. Small industry was free. One bad result of this was that small industry was squeezed in its efforts to obtain labor, materials, or credit, and its products were in scarce supply at high prices. Another result was that agricultural prices, being free and competitive, fell lower and lower as agricultural production recovered, but industrial prices, being monopolistic or in short supply, remained high. The result was a scissors crisis, as it is called in Europe, or parity prices, as it is called in America. This meant that the goods farmers sold were at low prices, while the goods they bought were at high prices and scarce. Thus, in 1923, agricultural prices were at 58% of the 1913 level, while industrial prices were at 187% of their 1913 level, so that peasants could obtain only 1/3 as much manufactured goods for their crops as they had been able to obtain in 1913. By withholding credit from industry, the government was able to force factories to liquidate their stocks of goods by lowering prices. As a consequence, by 1924, industrial prices fell to 141% of 1913, while agricultural prices rose 77% of 1913. The peasant's position was improved from 1/3 to 1/2 of his 1913 position, but at no time did he regain his 1913 parity level. This gave rise to a great deal of agrarian discontent and to numerous peasant disturbances during the latter part of the new economic policy. Lenin had insisted that the weakness of the proletariat in Russia made it necessary to maintain an alliance with the peasantry. This had been done during the period of state capitalism, November 1917 to June 1918, but the alliance had been largely destroyed in the period of war communism, June 1918 to April 1921. Under the new economic policy, this alliance was re-established, but the scissors crisis once again destroyed it. Then, it was re-established only partially. Stalin's victory over Trotsky and his personal inclination for terroristic methods of government led to decisions which marked the end of these cycles of peasant discontent. The decision to build socialism in a single country made it necessary, it was felt, to emphasize the predominance of heavy industry in order to obtain, as quickly as possible, the basis for the manufacture of armaments, chiefly iron, steel, coal, and electric power projects. Such projects required great masses of labor to be concentrated together and fed. Both the labor and the food would have to be drawn from the peasantry. But the emphasis on heavy industrial production rather than on light industry meant that there would be few consumers' goods to give to the peasantry in return for the food taken from them. Moreover, the drain of manpower from the peasantry to form urban labor forces would mean that those who continued to be peasants must greatly improve their methods of agricultural production in order to supply, with a smaller portion of peasants, food for themselves, for the new urban laborers, for the growing party bureaucracy, and for the growing Red Army, which was regarded as essential to defend socialism in a single country. The problem of obtaining increasing supplies of food from fewer peasants without offering them consumers' industrial goods in exchange could not, according to Stalin, be worked in a peasant regime based on freedom of commerce, as under the new economic policy of 1921 to 1927, or in one based on individual farmers, as in the war communism of 1918 to 1921. The former of these required that the peasants be given goods in exchange, while the latter could be made a failure by peasant refusals to produce more food than was required by their own needs. The new economic policy could not find a solution to this problem. In spite of the closing of the scissors in 1923 to 1927, industrial prices remained higher than farm prices. Peasants were reluctant to supply food to the cities since they could not get the city's products they wanted in return, and the amount of peasants' grain which was sold remained about 13% of the grain raised in 1927, compared to 26% in 1913. Such a system might provide a high standard of living for the peasants, but it could never provide the highly industrialized basis necessary to support socialism in a single country. The new direction which Russia's development took after 1927, and which we call Stalinism, is a consequence of numerous factors. Three of these factors were: 1. The bloodthirsty and paranoid ambitions of Stalin and his associates. 2. A return of Russia to its older traditions, but on a new level and a new intensity. And 3. A theory of social, political, and economic developments, which is included under the phrase socialism in a single country. This theory was embraced with such an insane fanaticism by the rulers of the new Russia, and provided such powerful motivations for Soviet foreign and domestic politics, that it must be analyzed at some length. The rivalry between Stalin and Trotsky in the mid-1920s was fought with slogans as well as with more violent weapons. Trotsky called for world revolution, while Stalin wanted communism in a single country. According to Trotsky, Russia was economically too weak and too backward to be able to establish a communist system alone. Such a system, all agreed, could not exist except in a fully industrialized country. Russia which was so far from being industrialized, could obtain the necessary capital only by borrowing it from abroad or by accumulating it from its own people. In either case, it would be taken, in the long run, from Russia's peasants by political duress, in the one case being exported to pay for foreign loans, and, in the other case, being given as food and raw materials to the industrial workers in the city. Both cases would be fraught with dangers. Foreign countries, because their own economic systems were capitalistic, would not stand idly by and allow a rival socialist system to reach successful achievement in Russia. Moreover, in either case, there would be a dangerously high level of peasant discontent, since the necessary food and raw materials would have to be taken from Russia's peasantry by political duress, without economic return. This followed from the Soviet theory that the enmity of foreign capitalist countries would require Russia's new industry to emphasize heavy industrial products able to support the manufacture of armaments rather than light industrial products able to provide consumers goods which could be given to the peasants in return for their produce. The Bolsheviks assumed, as an axiom, that capitalistic countries would not allow the Soviet Union to build up a successful socialistic system which would make all capitalism obsolete. This idea was strengthened by a theory to which Lenin made a chief contribution, that imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. According to this theory, a fully industrialized capitalistic country enters upon a period of economic depression which leads it to embrace a program of warlike aggression. The theory insisted that the distribution of income in a capitalist society would become so inequitable that the masses of the people would not obtain sufficient income to buy the goods being produced by the industrial plants. As such unsold goods accumulated with decreasing profits and deepening depression, there would be a shift toward the production of armaments to provide profits and produce goods which could be sold, and there would be an increasingly aggressive foreign policy in order to obtain markets for unsold goods in backward or undeveloped countries. Such aggressive imperialism, it seemed to Soviet thinkers, would inevitably make Russia a target of aggression in order to prevent a successful communist system there from becoming an attractive model for the discontented proletariat in capitalist countries. According to Trotsky, all these truths made it quite obvious that socialism in a single country was an impossible idea, especially if that single country was as poor and backward as Russia. To Trotsky and his friends, it seemed quite clear that the salvation of the Soviet system must be sought in a world revolution, which would bring other countries, especially such an advanced industrial country as Germany, to Russia's side as allies. While the internal struggle between Trotsky and Stalin was wending its weary way in 1923 to 1927, it became quite clear not only that world revolution was impossible, and that Germany was not going either to a communist revolution or an alliance with the Soviet. It also became equally clear that oppressed colonial areas such as China were not going to ally with the Soviet Union. Communism in a single country had to be adopted as Russia's policy simply because there was no alternative. Communism in Russia alone required, according to Bolshevik thinkers, that the country must be industrialized with breakneck speed, whatever the waste and hardships, and must emphasize heavy industry and armaments rather than rising standards of living. This meant that the goods produced by the peasants must be taken from them by political duress without any economic return, and that the ultimate and authoritarian terror must be used to prevent the peasants from reducing their level of production to their own consumption needs, as they had done in the period of war communism in 1918 to 1921. This meant that the first step toward the industrialization of Russia required that the peasantry be broken by terror and reorganized from a capitalistic basis of private farms, required that the peasantry be broken by terror and reorganized from a capitalistic basis of private farms to a socialistic system of collective farms. Moreover, to prevent imperialist capitalistic countries from taking advantage of the inevitable unrest this program would create in Russia, it was necessary to crush all kinds of foreign espionage resistance to the Bolshevik state, independent thought, or public discontent. These must be crushed by terror so that the whole of Russia could be formed into a monolithic structure of disciplined proletariat who would obey their leaders with such unquestioning obedience that it would strike fear in the hearts of every potential aggressor. The steps in this theory followed one another like the steps of a geometrical proposition. Failure of the revolution in industrially advanced Germany required that communism be established in backward Russia. This demanded rapid industrialization with emphasis on heavy industry. This meant that the peasants could not obtain consumers' goods for their food and raw materials. This meant that the peasants must be reduced by terroristic duress to collective farms, where they could neither resist nor reduce their levels of production. This required that all discontent and independence be crushed under a despotic police state to prevent foreign capitalistic imperialists from exploiting the discontent or social unrest in Russia. To the rulers of the Kremlin, the final proof of the truth of this proposition appeared when Germany, which had not gone communist but had remained capitalistic, attacked Russia in 1941. A historian who might question the assumptions or the stages in this theory would also see that the theory made it possible for Bolshevik Russia to abandon most of its influences of Western ideology in Marxism, such as its humanitarianism, its equality, or its anti-militarists, anti-state bases, and allow it to fall back into the Russian tradition of a despotic police state resting on espionage and terror, in which there was a profound gulf in ideology and manner of living between the rulers and the ruled. It should also be evident that a new regime, such as Bolshevism was in Russia, would have no traditional methods of social recruitment or circulation of elites. These would be based on intrigue and violence, and would inevitably bring to the top the most decisive and most merciless, most unprincipled and most violent of its members. Such a group, forming around Stalin, began the process of establishing communism in a single country in 1927 to 1929, and continued it until interrupted by the approach of war in 1941. This program of heavy industrialization was organized in a series of 5-year plans, of which the first covered the years 1928 to 1932. The chief elements in the 5-year plan were the collectivization of the agriculture and the creation of a basic system of heavy industry. In order to increase the supply of food and industrial labor in the cities, Stalin forced the peasants off their own lands, worked by their own animals and their own tools, into large communal farms, worked cooperatively with lands, tools, and animals owned in common, or onto huge state farms run as state-owned enterprises by wage-earning employees using lands, tools, and animals owned by the government. In communal farms, the crops were owned jointly by the members and were divided after certain amounts had been set aside for taxes, purchases, and other payments, which directed food to the cities. In state farms, the crops were owned outright by the state, after the necessary costs had been paid. In time, experience showed that the costs of the state farms were so high, and their operations so inefficient, that they were hardly worthwhile, although they continued to be created. The shift to the new system came slowly in 1927 to 1929, and then was put violently into full operation in 1930. In the space of 6 weeks, February to March 1930, collective farms increased from 59,400 with 4,400,000 families to 110,200 farms with 14,300,000 families. All peasants who resisted were treated with violence. Their property was confiscated. They were beaten or sent into exile in remote areas. Many were killed. This process, known as the liquidation of the kulaks, since the richer peasantry resisted more vigorously, affected 5 million kulak families. Rather than give up their animals to the collective farms, many peasants killed them. As a result, the number of cattle was reduced from 30.7 million in 1928 to 19.6 million in 1933, while in the same 5 years, sheep and goats fell from 146.7 million to 50.2 million, hogs from 26 to 12.1 million, and horses from 33.5 to 16.6 million. Moreover, the planting season of 1930 was entirely disrupted, and the agricultural activities of later years continued to be disturbed, so that food production decreased drastically. Since the government insisted on taking the food needed to support the urban population, the rural areas were left with inadequate food, and at least 3 million peasants starved in 1931 to 1933. 12 years later, in 1945, Stalin told Winston Churchill that 12 million peasants died in this reorganization of agriculture. To compensate for these setbacks, large areas of previously uncultivated lands, many of them semi-arid, were brought under cultivation, mostly in Siberia, as state farms. Considerable research was done on new crop varieties to increase yields and to utilize the drier lands of the south and the shorter growing season in the north. As a consequence, the area under cultivation increased by 21% in 1927 to 1938. However, the fact that the Soviet population rose in the same 11 years from 150 million to 170 million persons meant that the cultivated acreage per capita rose only from 1.9 to 2.0 acres. The use of the semi-arid lands required a considerable extension of irrigation. Thus, there was an increase of about 50% in the acreage irrigated in the decade 1928 to 1938, from 10.6 million acres to 15.2 million acres. Some of these irrigation projects combined irrigation with the generation of electricity by water power, and provided improved water transportation facilities, as in our Tennessee Valley Authority. This was true of the famous project at Dnipropetrovsk on the lower Dnieper River, which had a capacity of 500,000 kilowatts, 1935. The reduction in farm animals, which was not made up by 1941, combined with the efforts to develop heavy industry, resulted in increased use of tractors and other mechanized equipment in agriculture. The number of tractors rose from 26.7 thousand in 1928 to 483.5 thousand in 1938, while in the same decade the percentage of plowing done by tractors increased from 1% to 72%. Harvesting was increasingly done by combines, the number of these increasing from almost none in 1928 to 182,000 in 1940. Such complicated machinery was not owned by the collective farms, but by independent machine tractor stations scattered about the country. They had to be hired from these as they were needed. The introduction of mechanized farming of this type was not an unmixed success, as many machines were ruined by inexperienced help, and the costs of upkeep and fuel were very high. Nevertheless, the trend toward mechanization continued, partly from a desire to copy the United States, and partly from a rather childish enthusiasm for modern technology. These two impulses combined, at times, to produce a gigantomania, or enthusiasm for large size rather than for efficiency or a satisfactory way of life. In agriculture, this gave rise to many enormous state farms of hundreds of thousands of acres, which were notoriously inefficient. Moreover, the shift to such large-scale mechanized agriculture, in contrast to the old Tsarist agriculture, organized in scattered peasant plots, cultivated in a 3-year, fallow rotation system, generally increased such problems as spreading drought, losses to insect pests, and decreasing soil fertility, requiring the use of artificial fertilizers. In spite of all these problems, Soviet agriculture, without ever becoming successful or even adequate, provided a steadily expanding base for the growth of Soviet industry, until both were disrupted by the invasion of Hitler's hordes in the summer of 1941. The industrial portion of the first 5-year plan was pursued with the same ruthless drive as the collectivization of agriculture and had semi-spectacular results. Impressive physical accomplishment, large-scale waste, lack of integration, ruthless disregard of personal comfort and standards of living, constant purges of opposition elements, of scapegoats, and of the inefficient, all to the accompaniment of blasts of propaganda inflating the plan's real achievements to incredible dimensions, attacking opposition groups, sometimes real and frequently imaginary, within the Soviet Union, or mixing scorn with fear in verbal assaults on foreign capitalist imperialist countries and their secret saboteurs within Russia. The first 5-year plan of 1928 to 1932 was followed by a second plan of 1933 to 1937 and a third plan of 1938 to 1942. The last of these was completely disrupted by the German invasion of June 1941 and had from the beginning undergone periodic modifications which changed its targets in the direction of an increased emphasis on armaments because of the rising international tensions. Because of the inadequacies of the available Soviet statistics, it is not easy to make any definite statements about the success of these plans. There can be no doubt that there was a great increase in the physical output of industrial goods, and that this output was very largely in capital equipment rather than in consumer goods. It is also clear that much of this advance was uncoordinated and spotty, and that while Soviet national income was rising, the standard of living of the Russian peoples was declining from its 1928 level. The following estimates made by Alexander Baikov will give some idea of the magnitude of the achievement of the Soviet economic system in the period 1928 to 1940. Coal in millions of tons. 1928. 35.0. In 1940, 166.0. Oil in millions of tons. 1928, 11.5. 1940, 31.1. Pig iron in millions of tons. 1928, 3.3. 1940, 15.0. Steel, millions of tons. 1928, 4.3. 1940, 18.3. Cement, millions of tons. 1928, 1.8. 1940, 5.8. Electric power, in billion kilowatts. 1928, 5.0. 1940, 48.3. Cotton textiles, in million meters. 1928, 2,742.0. 1940, 3,700.0. Woolen textiles, in million meters. 1928, 93.2. 1940, 120.0. Leather shoes, in million pairs. 1928, 29.6. 1940, 220.0. Railroad freight, in billion-ton kilometers. 1928, 93.4. 1940, 415.0. Total population, in millions. 1928, 150.0. 1940, 173.0. Urban population, estimated percentage. 1928, 18.0%. 1940, 33.0%. Employed persons, in millions. 1928, 11.2. 1940, 31.2. Total wage payments in millions of rubles. 1928, 8.2. 1940, 162.0. Grain crops, in millions of hectoliters. 1928, 92.2. 1940, 111.2. There can be little doubt that this tremendous achievement in industrialization made it possible for the Soviet system to withstand the German assault in 1941. At the same time, the magnitude of the achievement produced great distortions and tensions in Soviet life. Millions of persons moved from villages to cities, some of these entirely new, to find inadequate housing, inadequate food, and violent psychological tensions. On the other hand, the same move opened to them wide opportunities in free education for themselves and for their children, as well as opportunities to rise in the social, economic, and party structures. As a consequence of such opportunities, class distinctions reappeared in the Soviet Union. The privileged leaders of the secret police and the Red Army, as well as the leaders of the party and certain favored writers, musicians, ballet dancers, and actors, obtaining incomes so far above those of the ordinary Russian that they lived in quite a different world. The ordinary Russian had inadequate food and housing, was subject to extended rationing, having to stand in line for scarce consumers' items or even to go without them for long periods, and was reduced to living with his family in a single room, or even, in many cases, to a corner of a single room shared with other families. The privileged rulers and their favorites had the best of everything, including foods and wines, the use of vacation villas in the country or in the Crimea, the use of official cars in the city, the right to live in old Tsarist palaces and mansions, and the right to obtain tickets to the best seats at the musical or dramatic performances. These privileges of the ruling group, however, were obtained at a terrible price, at the cost of complete insecurity, for even the highest party officials were under constant surveillance by the secret police and inevitably would be purged, sooner or later, to exile or to death. The growth of inequality was increasingly rapid under the 5-year plans and was embodied in law. All restrictions on maximum salaries were removed. Variations in salaries grew steadily wider and were made greater by the non-monetary privileges extended to the favored upper ranks. Special stores were established where the privileged could obtain scarce goods at low prices. 2 or even 3 restaurants with entirely different menus were set up in industrial plants for different levels of employees. Housing discrimination became steadily wider. All wages were put on a piecework basis. Even when this was quite impractical. Work quotas and work minimums were steadily raised. Much of this differentiation of wages was justified under a fraudulent propaganda system known as Stakhanovism. In September 1935, a miner named Stakhanov mined 102 tons of coal in a day, 14 times the usual output. Similar exploits were arranged in other activities for propaganda purposes and used to justify speed-up, raising of production quotas, and wage differences. At the same time, the standard of living of the ordinary worker was steadily reduced, not only by raising quotas, but also by a systematic policy of segmented inflation. Food was purchased from the collective farms at low prices and then sold to the public at high prices. The gap between these two was steadily widened year by year. At the same time, the amount of produce taken from the peasants was gradually increased by one technique or another. When collective farms had to shift to tractors and combines, these were taken from the farms themselves and centralized in machine tractor stations, controlled by the government. They had to be hired at rates which approached 1/5 of the total output of the collective farm. One of the chief sources of governmental income was a turnover tax, sales tax, on consumers' goods. This varied from item to item, but was generally about 60% or more. It was not imposed on producers' goods, which were, on the contrary, subsidized to the extent of half the government's expenditures. Price segmentation was so great that in the period 1927 to 1948, consumers' prices went up 30-fold, wages went up 11-fold, while prices of producers' goods and armaments went up less than threefold. This served to reduce consumption and to falsify the statistical picture of the national income, standards of living, and the breakdown between consumers' goods, capital goods, and armaments. As public discontent and social tensions grew in the period of the 5-year plans and the collectivization of agriculture, the use of spying, purges, torture, and murder increased out of all proportion. Every wave of discontent, every discovery of inefficiency, every recognition of some past mistake of the authorities resulted in new waves of police activity. When the meat supplies of the cities almost vanished after the collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s, more than a dozen of the high officials in charge of meat supplies in Moscow were arrested and shot, although they were in no way responsible for the shortage. By the middle 1930s, the search for saboteurs and for enemies of the state became an all-enveloping mania, which left hardly a family untouched. Hundreds of thousands were killed, frequently on completely false charges, while millions were arrested and exiled to Siberia or put into huge slave labor camps. In these camps, under conditions of semi-starvation and incredible cruelty, millions toiled in mines, in logging camps in the Arctic, or building new railroads, new canals, or new cities. Estimates of the numbers of persons in such slave labor camps in the period just before Hitler's attack in 1941 vary from as low as 2 million to as high as 20 million. The majority of these prisoners had done nothing against the Soviet state or the communist system, but consisted of the relatives, associates, and friends of persons who had been arrested on more serious charges. Many of these charges were completely false, having been trumped up to provide labor in remote areas, scapegoats for administrative breakdowns, and to eliminate possible rivals in the control of the Soviet system, or simply because of the constantly growing mass paranoidal suspicion which enveloped the upper levels of the regime. In many cases, incidental events led to large-scale reprisals for personal grudges far beyond any scope justified by the event itself. In most cases, these liquidations took place in the cells of the secret police, in the middle of the night, with no public announcements except the most laconic. But in a few cases, spectacular public trials were staged in which the accused, usually famous Soviet leaders, were berated and reviled. Boldly confessed their own dastardly activities and, after conviction, were taken out and shot. These purges and trials kept the Soviet Union in an uproar and kept the rest of the world in a state of continuous amazement throughout the period of the 5-year plans. In 1929, a large group of party leaders who objected to the ruthless exploitation of the peasantry, the so-called rightist opposition, led by the party's most expert theoretician of the Marxist ideology, Nikolai Bakharin, was purged. In 1933, about a third of the members of the party, at least 1 million names, were expelled from the party. In 1935, following upon the murder of a Stalinist supporter, Sergei Kirov, by the secret police, many of the old Bolsheviks, including Zinoviev and Kamenev, were tried for treason. The following year, just as the Spanish Civil War was beginning, the same group were tried once more as Trotskyists and were shot. A few months later, another large group of old Bolsheviks, including Carroll Quigley and Grigory Pyatakov, were tried for treason and executed. Later in that same year, 1937, evidence that the Soviet army leaders had been in communication with the German High Command was sent from the German secret police through Beneš, the president of Czechoslovakia, to Stalin. These communications had been going on since before 1920, were an open secret to careful students of European affairs, and had been approved by both governments as part of a common front against the Western democratic powers. Nevertheless, this information was used as an excuse to purge the Red Army of most of its old leaders. While 8 of the highest generals, led by Marshal Mikhail Tuchalchevsky, were executed, less than a year later, in March 1938. The few remaining old Bolsheviks were tried, convicted, and executed. These included Bukharin, Alexei Rukov, who had succeeded Lenin as president of the Soviet Union, and G. Yagoda, who had been head of the secret police. For every leader who was publicly eliminated by these Moscow treason trials, thousands were eliminated in secret. By 1939, all of the older leaders of Bolshevism had been driven from public life, and most had died violent deaths, leaving only Stalin and his younger collaborators such as Molotov and Voroshilov. All opposition to this group, in action, word, or thought, was regarded as equivalent to counter-revolutionary sabotage and aggressive capitalistic espionage. Under Stalinism, all Russia was dominated by three huge bureaucracies: of the government, of the party, and of the secret police. Of these, the secret police was more powerful than the party, and the party more powerful than the government. Every office, factory, university, collective farm, research laboratory, or museum had all three structures. When the management of a factory sought to produce goods, they were constantly interfered with by the party committee, cell, or by the special department, the secret police unit, within the factory. There were two networks of secret police spies, unknown to each other, one serving the special department of the factory, while the other reported to a high level of the secret police outside. Most of these spies were unpaid and served under threats of blackmail or liquidation. Such liquidations could range from wage reductions, which went to the secret police, through beatings or torture, to exile, imprisonment, expulsion from the party, if a member, and to murder. The secret police had enormous funds, since it collected wage deductions from large numbers and had millions of slave laborers in its camps to be rented out, like draft animals on a contract basis for state construction projects. Whenever the secret police needed more money, it could sweep large numbers of persons without trial or notice into its wage deduction system or into its labor camps to be hired out. It would seem that the secret police, operating in this fashion, were the real rulers of Russia. This was true, except at the very top, where Stalin could always liquidate the head of the secret police by having him arrested by his second-in-command, in return for Stalin's promise to promote the arrestor to the top position. In this way, the chiefs of the secret police were successively eliminated. V. Menzinsky was replaced by Yagoda in 1934, Yagoda by Nikolai Yezhov in 1936, and Yezhov by Lavrentiy Droy in 1938. These rapid shifts sought to cover up the falsifications of evidence which these men had prepared for the great purges of the period, each man's mouth being closed by death as his part in the elimination of Stalin's rivals was concluded. To keep the organization subordinate to the party, none of the leaders of the secret police was a member of the Politburo before Zyoy, and Zyoy was completely Stalin's creature until they perished together in 1953. It would be a grave mistake to believe that the Soviet system of government, with its peculiar amalgam of censorship, mass propaganda, and ruthless terror, was an invention of Stalin and his friends. It would be equally erroneous to believe that this system is a creation of Bolshevism. The truth is that it is a part of the Russian way of life, and has a tradition going back through Tsarism to Byzantianism and to Caesarism. In Russia itself, it has typical precedents in Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Paul I, or Alexander III. The chief changes were that the system, through the advance of technology, of weapons and communications, and of transportation, became more pervasive, more constant, more violent, and more irrational. As an example of its irrationality, we might point out that policy was subject to sudden reversals, which not only were pursued with ruthless severity, but under which, once policy had shifted, those who had been most active in the earlier official policy were liquidated as saboteurs or enemies of the state for their earlier activities as soon as the policy was changed. In the late 1920s, officials in the Ukraine had to speak Ukrainian. In a few years, those who did were persecuted for seeking to disrupt the Soviet Union. As leaders were shifted, each demanded 100% loyalty, which became an excuse for liquidation by a successor as soon as the leader changed. The reversals in policy toward the peasants created many victims, as did the violent reversals in foreign policy. Soviet-German relations shifted from a basis of friendship in 1922 to 1927 to one of most violent animosity in 1933 to 1939, changed to patent friendship and cooperation in 1939 to 1941, to be followed by violent animosity again in 1941. These reversals of policy were difficult for the heavily censored Russian people to follow. They were almost impossible for Soviet sympathizers or members of communist parties in foreign countries to follow, and they were very dangerous to the leaders of the Soviet system, who might find themselves under arrest today for having followed a different but official policy a year previously. Yet in spite of all these difficulties, the Soviet Union continued to grow in industrial and military strength in the decade before 1941. In spite of low standards of living, racking internal tensions, devastating purges, economic dislocations, and large-scale waste and inefficiency, the industrial basis of Soviet power continued to expand. Nazi Germans, and the outside world in general, were more aware of the tensions, purges, dislocations, and inefficiency than they were of the growing power, with the result that all were amazed at the Soviet Union's ability to withstand the German assault which began on June 22, 1941.